So thank you all. And now let's talk a bit about what's planned ahead. So epidemics and natural disasters, managing business in a time of crisis. This is our course. And we are all experiencing now this dramatic and historical event of the coronavirus. The world is investing tremendous resources to overcome the outbreak, of course, and to try and understand its medical and economic effects. We all understand and we are beginning to feel that this crisis will have enormous implications on our lives, definitely economic implications. So that's why here in the Arison School, we decided to use this crisis as a learning opportunity. And the goal is to share academic expertise from various disciplines, but that are all related to management, for making managerial decisions and dealing with crisis. And I think in the spirit of Winston Churchill's known saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, a key part of this course will be devoted to understanding the opportunities that arise as a result of this crisis. Sorry. So what is planned? What's ahead of us? How will our course look? Let's just quickly go over the outline. So today is our first session. In 2 minutes, Professor Chashai will introduce our lectures and the topics. Next week, session number 2, we will host Professor Dan Ariely from the Duke University. He will talk about how to change behavior in standard times, but also in Corona times. We will also have Professor Avramov from the Arison School. He will talk about the reactions of the financial markets on the COVID-19. Then session 3, we will have Professor Trachtenberg from the School of Economics. She will talk about the coronavirus impact on globalization and economic growth. And we will have Dr. Pereg from the School of Psychology, who will give a more psychological point of view and will discuss work environment and crisis. Then in the 4th session, we will have Dr. Hochman from the School of Psychology. He will talk about behavioral ethics in times of crisis, and Professor Lieberman will interview Professor Ashkenazi from the Sheba Medical Center. They will talk about decision-making under uncertainty. Then session 5, we will have a marketing session. We'll have Professor Libai from the Arison School. He will talk about new product growth and the coronavirus. Interestingly, the graph of new product growth has very similar aspect to the graph we all know of the growth of the coronavirus, and that's super interesting. We will also have Professor Goldenberg from the Arison School talking about being systematically creative in times of crisis. Then in our last session, please notice that we'll have 1 week break for Chag Shavuot. So our last 6th session will be on June 5th. We will have distinguished professors from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. We will have Professor Mauro. He will talk about economic and business impact of the COVID-19. And we will also host Professor Jerry Wind, who will talk about opportunities in times of crisis. So probably you have various questions or want to know what is expected from you. So first, during sessions, again, we ask all of you to try as much as possible, remain with your cameras open, stay muted at all times. Any interaction or questions should be through the chat, and we are constantly on the chat, so we will help you and send your questions to the lecturers during their session. Assignments, so are you worried about homework assignments, etc.? So everything is really nicely detailed with all the specifics by Oded, the TA. It's in the Moodle and the syllabus. Just to give you a general overview, after each session, you will receive 1 or 2 questions that are related to the session and some readings, and you will be asked to submit a 1-page assignment in Hebrew and English within a week. And altogether, you can choose 4 out of the 6 weeks, the 6 assignments to submit. So you need to submit only 4. The default of the grade is either pass-fail, but you can choose a numerical grade if you prefer that. If you do so, you will have to notify our TA Oded by next Thursday. So again, all this information is in the Moodle and the syllabus. Okay, so before we continue, any dramatic, important questions for this stage, for expectations, content, anything? Okay, when I'm looking aside, I'm sorry, that's from my chat. So I'm stopping my share, and Miron, I'm moving the mic to you.
Thank you, Yonat. It was a pleasure to work on this course with you as well, and thanks for coming up with this initiative. You see, we are almost 170 participants here, which is amazing, and this only shows how much interest there is in the topic and the effects that the corona crisis has on managers. And as you've just described, or you have just seen, guys, I think we have a very rich program for you, highlighting different aspects of the corona crisis effects on managers. So we will be starting our first lecture of this series with Dr. Sivanie Shiran of our own. Sivanie heads the Arison program for leadership. Those of you who are doing your MBA with us, which is most of you are probably familiar with her. And Sivanie will share with us her take of how leadership, the upper echelon, should be influenced and should be reacting to the corona crisis. Sivanie, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much both to Yonat and to Niron. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to see so many faces, many of whom I recognize, and that's lovely. Let me open my presentation, just a moment. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So hopefully you can all see that well. Just give me a thumbs up. No? Great. Okay. So let me start by just giving us some quick thumbnail definitions for these two basic terms that I've put together, right? Crisis and leadership. Right? Because what we're looking at is crisis in times of leadership in times of crisis. And so what actually do we mean when we use the word crisis? So I want to propose that we think of it as an event that's going to lead to an unstable or dangerous situation affecting an individual, a group, a community, or even a whole society. And obviously in our situation, we're talking about the whole world. And we need to acknowledge that this crisis, certainly, but many crises, are defining events, right? Abraham Lincoln talked about this during the Civil War. He has this wonderful quote where he talks about how we're going to be judged, right, by how we behave in these times. And so it is in many ways going to be the defining event of our lives. And that may seem weighty to begin with, but I think it's absolutely true. And I'm going to come back to that towards the end of my talk. The other thing we need to acknowledge about crises is that they pose for us an adaptive challenge. That is to say, we can't continue in our usual modus operandi, right? Crisis usually calls us to question the basic assumptions under which we've been operating. And it means we're going to have to adapt in a whole new way. Okay, and that's going to connect up with what Yonat said earlier about not wasting the opportunities that are inherent in a crisis. So what do we mean by leadership? Peter Drucker, who was a wonderful management consultant, famously said that management is about doing things right, and leadership is about doing the right thing. And I have to say that after studying leadership for many years and working in the field, I've found that that simple thumbnail definition is actually probably the best of them. And so we need to think about that. Certainly if you're working as a manager, right, what the difference is between management and leadership. And I want to focus our talk today on leadership and not about management. Certainly you'll come back to talking about management in the other lectures. So let's talk for a minute about how leaders are born. And this is kind of an age-old conversation, actually, one that frankly gets old pretty quickly. But what we have is two camps that often repeat, right? One camp that says leaders are born, right? You either have it or you don't. And we all are born hoping that we have it and then discover along the way, well, either we did or we didn't, right? The other camp, which I have to confess to being a part of, believes that leadership is nurtured and can be nurtured, which is to say that if we work on ourselves, if we develop self-awareness, if we work on practicing and exercising the muscles needed for leadership, we can step into leadership and take on and assume greater and greater leadership over the course of our lives. But in the case of crises, we have to think actually about how they help in the development of leadership. Crises essentially are petri dishes for leaders, right? Leaders are made, they're forged in times of crisis. And they sprout up, you know, when you least expect them, sort of under desert conditions, if you will. Yeah. And let me go back for a second. I'll just say that what we find in those conditions of crisis is that people are parched for leadership, right? They're thirsty for it. And as you would expect in any good desert, people develop almost a mirage. You know, they want to believe that leadership can be found, and they will go to great lengths to find it. So I want to take us to this image I hope that you recognize from The Wizard of Oz, right? Akosemi Eretz Utz, for those of you who saw it in the Israeli version. And in that, you know, old movie, we have the main characters setting out on a great journey in search of the ultimate authority, right? The leader who can give them everything their heart desires and save them from the things that's hurt them most in life and that they've most needed. And when they finally arrive in Oz, they stand before the Almighty, the Omnipotent, and they plead for what their heart desires. And what they find ultimately is this great wizard, you know, this ultimate omnipotent authority is actually just a fallible human being. Right? And that is, of course, the fate, right, of many of us who come with great expectations for our leaders. Yeah? And so we need to think a bit about where that comes from, psychologically speaking, what expectations we come to when we look for leadership, because that's going to influence what we find. And what I want to suggest is that those expectations come from a very old place in us. They come from our beginnings, from the earliest of our experiences, the times when we were just little babies, actually, small enough to kind of fit in our parents' hands. That was our first experience of authority, right? Those were our first leaders. And the experiences that we had there essentially helped us to develop assumptions, both about who we are, but also about who they are, about who authority figures are, and what leadership is going to be all about, or their leadership is going to be all about. And so actually the process of looking towards leaders, perceiving leadership, is actually quite a regressive process, right? It takes us back to our earliest of life experiences. So I want us to try and understand those early life experiences as best we can. And of course, we have a very short amount of time. So what I'll do is just very briefly share with you a bit about attachment theory. John Bowlby, who you see here in the picture, was kind of the father of attachment theory. And what he suggested was that in that first initial relationship that we have with our authority figures, we have a need to see them, to use them as a secure base. And then that need has to do with a need for security and a need for comfort, much more than it does a need to get, nourishment, if you will. So he based his theory on actually a research experiment done by a man named Harlow, a psychologist named Harlow, who looked at baby monkeys. And they assumed that the baby monkeys would always choose the mother monkey that offered them milk. But actually what they found was that these baby monkeys were much more interested in spending time on an object that felt furry, right? That offered them comfort and proximity. And that they stayed very closely attached to that comfort object. And what does all this have to do with leadership in the time of Corona? I'm getting to that. But first we have to make the link. And the link is, to how, as children, we experienced our parents as leaders. Yeah? We looked to them to be a secure base for us, a safe haven, if you will, that we could go to in times of distress, that we could go to for comfort. And then once we felt secure enough, once we had enough trust that they would be there for us in times of need, we allowed ourselves to pick up, get off their laps, get out of their hugs and their embrace, and begin to walk, and begin to explore, and begin to take risks. And it turns out that it's those same basic psychological needs that accompany us in our adult lives, in adolescence, in our love relationships, but also in our adult relationships with our bosses, with our political leaders, with anyone who we perceive in a position of authority. And certainly, if I come back to the topic of crises, crises are a bit like a child that falls down and gets a boo-boo, right? We are scared. The uncertainty, the danger, the fear of loss that creeps in times of crisis, all leads us to want that security, that stability that we first experienced with our original secure bases. Franklin Roosevelt, who was kind of the ultimate figure, father figure in that sense, has this wonderful quote where he says, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," where he talks about that, right? What fear does to us when it's not contained, and how that in and of itself is dangerous. So what I want to suggest is that the leaders now, certainly in the Corona crisis, are serving for us as a secure base in much the same way that our parents did when we were little children. And the same principles that applied then, and are probably applying if you have children of your own, apply now, right, to the way what we look for in them and what makes for effective leadership in them. So things like proximity and availability, right, just being there, a sense of stability and resilience, a sense of being reliable and trustworthy in terms of their honesty, an ability to show empathy and compassion to our plight, to our distress, an ability to contain our anxiety, and finally, the ability to show caring and to offer protection in the sense of being a safe haven. So let me break some of that down for you, because that's a mouthful, obviously, and offer some examples. So first, one that you're all, I'm sure, familiar with from the political arena, the governor of New York, Cuomo. He's a wonderful example of being a reliable leader and offering proximity, because he has a briefing, at the same time, every day. Everyone knows that at 11:30, he's going to be there by hook and by crook, and he's going to tell us the truth about where things stand and what we know and what we don't know. Right? And so it's like clockwork, right? We know he's going to be there. There's a routine. For those of you who have children at home, I'm sure you've caught on to the fact that they also need routine, right? They need to know when you're coming home or when you're going to be available to speak with them, when you come out of your Zoom meetings, right? They need that to have that reliability. He also does something interesting in terms of framing, both appearing resilient himself, right? He always has this kind of demeanor of someone who's put together, or holding it together. But he also talks to us about our resilience as a people. For the Americans, he talks about past times when they've been tested and how they fared. And he tries to give kind of put the corona crisis within that time frame and say, look, we've been through worse, right? How did the joke go on the internet that came around at the beginning of the crisis in Israel? Look, we survived concentration camps and the rest of it, what's staying at home on the couch, right? Not a big deal. So reminding us that we are resilient is helpful. And of course, appearing resilient himself arouses in us a sense of trust. If we're going to talk about the resilience of the leader, we have to talk about self-care. And, there's this famous thing that's kind of been said ad nauseum now on the internet, of course, but it's so true, right? That we have to first take care of ourselves if we're going to be available to take care of other people. And this example from airplane emergencies, right? Airplane crashes. That you first need as the parent to put the oxygen mask on yourself before your child is going to be willing to put on theirs, right? And that's critical. So even if your instinct as a parent is to want to first take care of your children, it's so important first that you take care of yourself so you'll be available to take care of them. And of course, we have, the Prime Minister of the UK as a wonderful example of someone who perhaps didn't take good enough care of himself, and how that rendered him essentially impotent and out of business for quite some time during this critical crisis. But let's go on to talk about these other components that play into the trust we have in leaders. And one thing that's become really apparent during this crisis is how necessary brutal honesty is. And that's something I can say for Israelis, that's something we're quite good at usually, brutal honesty, but also transparency, right? So tell the truth and tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, said very early on, this is serious, take it seriously. She didn't deny the danger. She didn't experience, she didn't express anger. She just called it like it was. As the expression goes in Hebrew, call the boy by his name. And of course, her numbers in Germany are much, much lower than the rest of Europe. I won't waste time on, other examples that we all know too well. But of course, Trump has been slammed big time with regard to his ability to kind of be transparent and take the danger gravely and portray it as such. Let's go on to empathy and care. This is something that often gets overlooked in the day-to-day workings of a business, but it's utterly critical and certainly in times of crisis. We have, the Prime Minister of Norway who actually gave a briefing to the children of Norway. So she said, okay, enough about the parents and the adults. Let's talk about the children's fears, right? Understanding that the children's fears are really not any different than the adult fears in that sense. And so in a way, she was talking to all of us when she addressed them. But what she did, and what it means to actually be empathic, is to articulate the fears and concerns that people have and to validate them, right? To say, you're not crazy, right? We all feel this. We're all worried. We're all anxious about this, that, and the next thing. And what it means to, when psychologists say to contain anxiety, what they mean by that in simple terms is to show that you can withstand, the anxious outbursts that people often have, right? You're all pent up in your homes. You have spouses or, other family members, and this is very difficult, right? People take their anxiety out on each other, and you have to put up with it, right? But that's what it means to contain anxiety as a leader. Jeff Bezos from Amazon, at first was hailed as a hero in February, actually, for contributing billions of dollars to climate change. But soon after, in March, was really harshly criticized for not taking enough care of his employees and not offering enough protective equipment. And when a New York employee spoke out against it, they were fired, right? And so there was a big walkout of employees and the company, and Amazon has been slammed for that in this crisis. A couple of other business examples. The CEO of Target has, done incredible work to give workers a feeling that they care, right? That their leadership sees them, understands their needs, and is trying as best they can to address them. Doug McMillon of Walmart, similarly, right? Actually offering bonuses, right, for time that employees are spending trying to keep things up and running. And there have been a number of examples of business leaders who have actually tried to, when they couldn't look after their employees, tried to help them find someone who could, right? To actually help them find other jobs. So the Qantas Airlines cut a deal with another company that their employees would be hired by them and tried to make that easier. And there were a number of examples of that, of employees being redeployed to other companies. The really essential thing to notice here is that one of the critical tasks of a leader in times of crisis is managing people's emotions, helping people move from the fear of loss and the danger to a sense of hope for the future. And we have, that's true both for a parent who lets their child get off the lap again, and venture forth. And also from our political leaders, for example, Queen Elizabeth in the UK, going online and going on television and trying to reassure everyone that we will meet again, right? And simply her age, tells us, her simple presence at that age assures us, right, that she is still alive, that we are still here, that we will meet again. But there are two, I would say, basic elemental aspects to leadership that are always true, and they become even more true during times of crisis. And that is, one is trust, right, which I just spoke about, this notion of being a secure base for people and allowing people to develop a sense of trust in you. And on the other hand, demonstrating your competence as a leader. And, I'm sure they're going to talk about this more in other lectures, so I won't drill down on this a lot. But, showing in times of crisis that you're proactive in soliciting information, because there's not enough of it, right? Leaders in times of crisis, they navigate from point to point because they don't know where this is going. They don't know where this is headed. they act with agility, right? So at each point they see, what's possible and what's not possible, and they experiment. They dare to make some decisive decisions, and they see how they pan out. They learn quickly from the results, and then they move on, right? They don't get hung up on them. In terms of decisiveness, we have a number of lovely examples, both from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's only 39 years old, which is really quite incredible, and also Adam Silver, who's the NBA commissioner. Both of them actually decided very early on in this crisis that they were going to take a harsh approach, and they were going to, crack down. So Adam Silver, postponed the NBA games. And of course, that saved a tremendous number of lives. And New Zealand's now in great standing. They've had very, very few new cases of corona in that country. So it's really been outstanding leadership in that regard. A few more words about kind of the exercise of leadership and what makes for an outstanding leader. I would say the number one attribute of a leader is that they are able to learn. Okay, John F. Kennedy has this wonderful quote where he talks about learning and leadership are indispensable to each other. And leaders learn from experience. And they do that by exercising their reflective muscle, right? Ron Heifetz from the Kennedy School at Harvard talks about getting on the balcony as a leader, getting off of the dance floor and actually taking a step out, is zooming out and looking down and seeing the big picture and how important that is, that time for reflection. And that's not an easy thing to do, of course, because there is a tremendous amount of pressure on leaders to be active, to do something, right? To be proactive, and having the ability to withstand that pressure and say, wait a minute, I'm going to take a time out. I'm going to step back and reflect and be in that space of not knowing, allows them to really process and hear better what's going on around them. So when we talk about learning, what they do is really challenge the assumptions that we all have been holding on to so dearly. And by challenging those assumptions, they're able to change mindsets, both their own and those of other people. And of course, in the business world, we need some changing. So business as usual wasn't so great to begin with, I'm sorry to say. There was a tremendous amount of criticism in the past, and we didn't really heed the call. So there was a lack of faith in leadership in the private sector that's been well documented at this point, and for good reason. And the pandemic, in a sense, has forced us to acknowledge that this may be a turning point, that it's no longer possible to continue with business as usual. We may have to start doing things differently and acting more responsibly. So we're moving from a sort of a mentality of only attending to our shareholders to thinking more about our stakeholders, thinking about the larger community and how the private sector fits into that system. Yeah. And how we can collaborate both with the public sector, with NGOs, with government, etc., to really change the way people experience life. It's been really interesting, and I'm trying to rush a bit so I don't hold everyone up, but it's been very interesting to me in the past to hear my business students talk about government. They tend to speak about government, you tend to speak about government with a lot of disgust, right? Particularly the word regulation. The word regulation is often said almost with a spit. And I think the coronavirus pandemic, in a really interesting way, has forced us to acknowledge that regulation might not be all bad, right? It might be a necessary evil in part. And so we're seeing companies move from an attitude of compliance, reluctant compliance with regulation, to even a more proactive stance how they can begin to innovate in social terms. And certainly one thing we've learned from the pandemic is that change is possible. You know, that's been shocking to all of us, I think, right? That we tended to assume that there's so much resistance. Business leaders don't want to change. We all don't want, we can't really change. Quite honestly, most of the professors I know at IDC and elsewhere, you know, really didn't think they would ever learn this digital technology. And yet here we are, you know, just a few days later. So it turns out change is possible and much more quickly than we thought, right? But one of the things we learned from adaptive leadership is that change is possible with optimal heat. That is to say, if we contain the anxiety so much that people really aren't worried at all, right, then there isn't enough heat to make them want to change, right? The food won't get cooked, if you continue the metaphor. But if the heat is so high that they're so anxious about the constant change and uncertainty, then they're paralyzed, right? And then they're also not able to change. So we really have to get the temperature right. And great leaders are really experimenting with finding that optimal heat, right? So we've moved, hopefully, we're beginning to move in the business sector from problem solving, putting out fires, to thinking more creatively about how we can operate differently. So when we talk about working through a crisis and we look towards the future, we're thinking about not just how to recover and how to overcome this crisis, but really how can we use the opportunity inherent in this crisis to reset and actually accelerate transformation, right? So rather than going back to business as usual, right, even though many of us just want to go back to normal, right, we can really begin to think about how can we create a business world, you know, work systems that are productive and fulfilling for people. I've heard many people say they actually are thinking about staying home and not going back to work, just working from home at the end of the crisis. But I think it's less about their enjoyment of staying home and more about their disenchantment with the way their work lives are set up. I see you not moving around. Does that tell me that time is nearing the end?
So thanks for noticing. No, we have a few more minutes and we can also chunk up the break for a few minutes. But do keep in mind, we want to offer the students to ask a couple of questions. So
Sure.
Let's say take 5 more minutes and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I am nearing towards the end. I want to continue the metaphor for a moment of the optimal heat and the fire. And use this wonderful title from Malcolm Gladwell's book that's now a bit old, called The Tipping Point, where he actually talks about social change as an epidemic, which I think it was very interesting when he first came out with it. But it's also interesting to look back on it now in light of the current situation. And I think in the private sector, what we're seeing perhaps, and maybe I'm being over-optimistic here, perhaps is the igniting of an epidemic of doing good. Right? We're seeing more and more business leaders step up to think about how they can actually contribute to people, you know, in terms of their social well-being and not just in terms of getting money out of them. And we can draw on transformational leadership as a model to think about our business leaders who have stepped up as people who are leading by example, who are drawing on people's intrinsic motivation to do good, right, to make a difference. Who actually, what we know about transformational leadership, about these kinds of leaders, is that they tend to inspire subordinates to surpass expectations, and that they themselves are then inspired as leaders to surpass even what they thought possible, right? And so that's exceptional, right? Most of the time in the business world, we've thought about how we can get our employees to meet our expectations, not surpass them. So just some examples from the front lines. You know, there are all sorts of CEOs from airlines who have forfeited their salaries, their base salaries. other companies that have stepped up and done what they thought was necessary. But they've really shown up, right? And they're leading from the front with a lot of courage. They're also recalibrating to true north. And when I use that expression, what I mean is they're asking themselves about the purpose of their business. Where is all this headed? Why did we get into this business to begin with? What did we want to provide? What is this all for? And they're asking their employees to connect to that deeper sense of purpose. And they're channeling that to drive important change and transformation in their organizations. So we have examples of business leaders who have actually used their production lines to deliver products that were needed by society now. Some really phenomenal examples, actually, that happened so quickly it was, just dizzying, really. One homegrown example from Israel, from Mellanox, offering opportunities to their employees to feel that they're making a difference in the current crisis has been really critical for employee engagement, for a sense of pride in the company. And it turns out that employee engagement, of course, will go the distance later on, right? We know that from the research. So I'm going to end, Yonat, by just drawing your attention, all of you, to something that I think is probably the most important point in the whole presentation, which is that leadership is not a noun, it's a verb, right? We like to talk about leaders and in that sense, pin it on everybody else but us. But actually, leadership is a verb, and we can all take it up from wherever we sit, from whatever rank and file we are in whatever hierarchy. And I wanted to share with you this interesting example from MBA students from some pretty impressive schools, actually, in the US. About 1,200 of them wrote an open letter to Fortune 500 CEOs, talking about, basically asking them to consider the well-being of their employees. And so they took up, their status as MBA students from impressive institutions to try and, put their weight in the game, if you will. And I know this might be stealing some of your time for questions, but I wanted to leave you with a few questions of my own, actually, about your leadership. So just quickly, one question for you to consider reflectively is, how will the current behavior of business leaders impact your choices as a consumer and perhaps as a future employee of those companies? What criteria are you going to use when you look back at this period to assess your own leadership? What do you want to be able to say that you did in this defining moment in history? And finally, the third question is, how does this period make you think differently about your career direction and your career choices? So I'll stop there, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. Great questions. I'm thinking about them as I speak. Until we see whether or not students have questions, I have a question to shoot. So you talked about the various types of leaders, and you mentioned the empathy and the caring, or maybe types of leaderships, not leaders. Like you said, it's more a verb. And I'm curious about your thoughts, putting politics aside, but we see in many countries, not specifically Israel, also Israel, but some types of leaderships that are more about intimidating, and people are talking about intimidating being some characteristic of a leader who wants everyone to surround him and be more endorsed in whatever he or she offers. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about your thoughts about being more intimidating in times of crisis from leaders.
That's a great question. One of the things we know is that fear, really propels people to long for almost a dictator, right? Someone who will step up, take the reins, and make everyone feel that it's going to be okay because they know, right? And so in a sense, there is an unconscious pull on the part of society to pull for a leader who will be more authoritarian. Now, how do we go from more authoritative to authoritarian and dictator? Well, there's a very slippery slope, as we all know. And that is a danger that we live in times of crisis, right? That will happen. And certainly we've seen it in history, and maybe we're seeing it in some parts currently, politics aside. And it is something we need to be careful about, right? Which is why it's so important that we're conscious of these fantasies and desires that we have of our leaders.
Okay, thank you so much. I see Oz Pravda has a question. Oz, do you want to unmute yourself for a second and ask that question directly?
Yeah, I'm asking, do you think these acts come from true care for the country or the employees, or as an act of PR or selfish reasons for the companies themselves? Thank you.
So, thank you so much for asking that, because I think that is on the minds of many of us often. But quite frankly, where I've arrived with that is that perhaps it doesn't matter so much, right? Perhaps their motivation is less important than their actions. We know from the research that those kinds of acts are both beneficial financially for a company, but they also do good socially. And so those two things can actually live hand in hand, right? They don't have to be mutually exclusive. And the faster we can wrap our heads around that, the better, right? So regardless of where their motivation came from, if the act is actually benefiting their employees, their customers, society and the community in general, God bless them, right? Why second guess it?
Okay, so we have a few more questions. So let's, from the question side of, let's try to be quick. We have Natalie, then Sam, Iftach, and Lior. So Natalie.
Are we okay with time, Yonat?
We still have like 5-6 minutes, and then everyone will have a 5-minute to go get some coffee or something, and we'll continue.
Okay.
My question was actually a response to Oz. I said that I was wondering if it really mattered, if it's a publicity stunt, if it serves the same end goal, which you just answered, perhaps doesn't matter so much.
It's always better when it comes from you than from me. So thank you.
Okay, cool. So now we have Sam, right? Sam, and then Iftach and Lior.
Hi there, Sivanie. I wanted to ask, there's a disproportionate number of the successful leaders are women, or the women leaders are disproportionately successful. Any theories why that is?
Yeah, so there's a wonderful article that was written, I don't know if you saw it, by Aviva Wittenberg Cox, who I actually met years ago at INSEAD, who's been doing work on this. And if you haven't seen the article, by all means, look it up. But I have to confess to treading on that ground rather carefully. So I'm not a fan of talking about men and women. I'm more a fan of talking about feminine and masculine leadership. And I think certainly, so the verdict is out, to answer your question head on, the verdict is out, right? It's about kind of the women and the men and how they panned out during this epidemic. But I think certainly we can say that attributes that have traditionally been associated with more feminine leadership are attributes that are proving to be terribly important in this pandemic, right? Things like empathy, caring, a lot of the stuff that I spoke about earlier, kind of managing anxiety, etc. And collaboration, between organizations and the environment and the larger society. Those are things that traditionally have been attributed more to female leadership, and they're turning out to be more and more important. So I think that question, really connects up with what Yonat asked earlier as well. because more authoritarian leadership has been associated with masculine leadership.
Great. Iftach and then Lior.
I also have a follow-up question to your Nats. So we talk about a lot of leaders using fear and intimidation tactics and how it's very effective and how it's very dangerous and stuff. Is there any way that intimidation tactics and fears are encouraged? Is there any place that is not only effective, but also benefiting for society, or also always, in any case, it's a bad thing? It's something that I'm curious about for a long time.
Rinat, do you want to answer that?
That was for me. I'm sorry. I thought it's, was it for me, Iftach?
No, it was actually for Shiran, but...
Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed that then. So Iftach, I thought you were addressing what Yonat said. So the question, just to repeat it, to make sure I got it right, you were asking if fear tactics are ever in place, if they're ever a worthy ploy?
Yes, if ever leadership that's using fear is in place.
Yeah. So the answer to that is always, it depends, right? It depends on the context, depends on the situation. This connects up with what I was trying to talk about earlier in terms of optimal heat. If people don't experience the platform as burning, they're not likely to leave the station, right? So they have to feel that something's changing. Change is inevitable and necessary, right? We can't stay where we are, right? So in that sense, fear can be used. But if you use it too much, right? And if you use it dishonestly, and I think maybe that's where Yonat was said it earlier, if you use it dishonestly to say, the aliens are coming and they're after us, therefore we have to change, then you're going to undermine your own credibility and you're going to erode trust.
Can I just say something, make a comment quickly on that? I think it also depends on what kind of society, because you're talking about more Western society. You're talking about North Korea or even China or even Singapore. Their leadership has a different approach than most Westernized leadership.
Yeah, no, it's an important point. Yeah.
So we have a quick question by Lior, so quickly, and then we can go for a break.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm asking regarding transparency. So there's the claim of some leaders saying that they just want to share their decisions and not sharing the motives that led them to the decision, because they don't want to seed any over information and cause confusion. So what do you reflect on that regarding transparency of information and the transparency of motives?
That's a great question, because it really adds a lot of nuance. Unfortunately, it adds so much nuance that I'm not sure I can really answer it, right? It's going to be on a case-by-case basis. So sometimes, adding the information builds credibility and trust, and sometimes adding the information just increases anxiety and kind of dismantles people's ability to digest the information. There may also not be time for it, right? It might be a question of urgency. So I think it always goes back to that question of, is this going to be helpful? Is this going to allow people to carry on with the changes they need to make now, right? Or is it going to overburden them and undermine their ability to kind of function effectively?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Shiran. This was fascinating for me, and I'm sure also for the students.